Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a new episode of our Letter to Vox podcast.
And welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a truly foundational, yet often overlooked text of 19th century German political economy.
Which text are we looking at?
It's called The National Economie der Gegenwart und Zukunft, which, translates to the national economy of the present and future.
A pretty ambitious title.
Incredibly ambitious. And it was published in the pivotal revolutionary year of 1848 by a man named Friedrich Bruno Hildebrand.
And that year, 1848, is absolutely key here, isn't it? This isn't some dusty, retrospective academic thesis.
Not at all. It's a fiercely polemical work. I mean, it was written while revolutions were literally shaking the foundations of Europe.
So he's right in the middle of it.
Exactly. And Hildebrand uses this text to conduct a kind of comprehensive postmortem on the economic philosophies of his time. He dissects and challenges the three great competing schools.
Okay, so who are the big players he was taking on?
Well, first you have classical liberalism, which he really saw as being embodied by Adam Smith and his followers. Then there's the Romantic school, represented by a thinker named Adam Miller.
And the third?
The third is national economics, which was championed by the very famous Friedrich List.
But this intellectual demolition, as you called it, it serves a higher purpose, right? It's not just about winning an argument.
No, his objective was intensely social and political. He was trying to provide a rigorous scientific framework for solving the most urgent societal crisis of his time.
Which was pauperism.
Pauperism, the staggering systemic poverty that was just devastating the industrializing world. And to do that, he had to directly confront the powerful, burgeoning early socialist and communist critiques that were gaining so much momentum across Europe.
So our mission today is pretty ambitious. We need to understand Bruno Hildebrand's pivotal role as a leader of what's called the older historical school of German economics.
And more importantly, we have to explore his radical call for a new method for economic science, a method grounded in history.
One that moves economics away from these abstract universal laws and forces it to address the realities of human culture, social development, and collective welfare head on.
Exactly. It's about moving from pure theory to actual social prescription.
So to really appreciate the fire and the passion in this book, we have to start with the author himself, Friedrich Bruno Hildebrand.
We do. And he was so far from the stereotype of, the cloistered, dusty academic.
Tell us a bit about him.
Well, he was born in Naumburg in 1812, and his early academic path was really broad. He started with theology at Leipzig, but then he quickly pivoted to philosophy, philology, and history.
And that diverse foundation seems crucial, right? It feels like it established his core belief that economic life is just inseparable from broader culture and history.
It is absolutely crucial. And his biography, it reads less like a professor's and more like a combination of a political activist and a public servant.
How so?
While he was studying at Leipzig, he dove headfirst into political engagement. He became an enthusiastic follower of the Alt-Leipziger Burschenschaft.
Which was what, exactly? A student association.
A student association, yeah. But one known for its very liberal and nationalist leanings. In the repressive climate of the 1830s, joining something like that was basically an act of rebellion.
And it had serious consequences for him.
It did. His radical leanings put him in direct conflict with the establishment. By late 1834, he actually spent a significant period in custody in Breslau just because of this affiliation.
Wow. So this early brush with political persecution must have really forged his independent and polemical spirit.
I think so. After he got his doctorate, he eventually secured a professorship for state sciences at Marburg in 1841. He even served as the rector of the university in 1844 and 1845.
But even that honor, being rector, it couldn't shield him from political trouble. His independent political writings just kept irking the authorities.
And that conflict flared up really dramatically in 1846.
What happened then?
In 1846, Bruno Hildebrand was charged with Majestätsbeleidigung.
For our listeners, what does that translate to?
It's roughly lèse majesté, or insulting the sovereign, insulting the king. The charge came from an article he published in the German Londoner Zeitung.
So he was suspended.
Immediately suspended from his duties. He faced this long legal battle that really mirrored the deep political tensions that were just brewing in German society.
And the outcome arrived at the most critical moment possible.
It really did. He was formally acquitted in early 1848, just as the revolutionary spirit was igniting across all the German states.
That acquittal must have felt like a huge personal and political vindication.
Oh, absolutely. It provided the fuel and the platform for his direct political involvement. His academic life was basically put on hold as his political career reached its climax in 1848 and 1849.
And he served as a delegate.
He served as a delegate in the War Parliament and then the Frankfurt National Assembly, representing his constituency. This experience of trying to legislate and build a modern state in the face of collapse and social crisis, that's the immediate, passionate backdrop for the book.
So after the political failure of the revolution in 1849, like a lot of liberal academics, he faced a choice.
He did. Bruno Hildebrand left Hesse in 1851 and moved to Switzerland, first to Zurich, then to Bern. And there, his professional path took this fascinating, very practical detour. He shifted from academic theory to hands-on institutional development.
This is where we see the empiricist and the statistician in him really emerge.
He didn't just teach, he became an infrastructure titan and a data pioneer.
An infrastructure titan.
I mean, he was a co-founder and director of the Swiss Nordostbahn, the Northeastern Railway, starting in 1853. And then later, he directed the Ost-West-Bahn, the East-West Railway, starting in 1857.
So this was literal nation building, laying the tracks for modern commerce.
Exactly. And the sources say this was not an easy transition for him. He faced heavy public opposition, intense, sometimes bitter, persecution during the development of the East-West Railway.
So he was still an agitator, even in the private sector.
He just couldn't help himself. But his contribution to statistical science is just as profound, and it directly influenced the methodology in his book.
In what way?
In 1856, he established the very first statistical bureau in Switzerland, in Bern, and later, when he returned to Germany, he directed the Statistical Bureau of the Thuringian States in Jena. This hands-on experience in collecting, cleaning, and analyzing hard data, that's what gives his later refutation of the utopian socialists so much intellectual weight.
He eventually did settle back into academia in Germany in 1861, taking up a professorship in Jena, where he earned the title of Privy Government Counselor and even served as rector twice.
He did.
But let's bring it back to his core theoretical legacy, the thing that informs his entire 1848 critique, his place in the historical school.
Right. Bruno Hildebrand is classified as a really significant figure in the older historical school of German political economy, alongside Wilhelm Roscher and Karl Mies.
And what was the defining feature of this school?
The rejection of universal, timeless economic laws. For them, economics is history. Economic phenomena can only be understood and analyzed within their specific cultural and temporal context.
And his primary theoretical contribution centers on creating a framework for this historical evolution, right? The sequence of economic stages.
Exactly. He argued that the human economy progresses through three necessary, distinct, and chronological stages.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's the natural exchange economy, which is based on barter and immediate exchange of goods without a medium.
Simple enough. What's second?
Second is the money economy, or Geldwirtschaft. This was the dominant system of his time, characterized by generalized commodity exchange mediated by currency.
And the third stage, the one he was looking forward to.
The anticipated future stage,
Right.
the credit economy. And this wasn't just about banks and loans, it was an entire system of economic organization where social relationships and collective trust, formalized through credit institutions, would supersede the individualistic, self-interested, and conflict-ridden nature of the money economy.
So this stages theory is the analytical lens he uses to judge every other school of thought in his 1848 work.
That's the key. It's his master framework.
Let's focus on the atmosphere that spawned this book. It's a direct response to the revolutionary crisis of 1848. Hildebrand's introduction doesn't start with theory. It starts with the stark reality of profound and unstable social change.
He begins by documenting the massive economic acceleration in Germany. He notes that alongside traditional agriculture, industry, what he calls fabrication, had become this formidable, undeniable economic power.
And fabrication in this context, just to be clear, means large-scale manufacturing, right? The engine of modern capitalism arriving in Germany.
Late, but very, very rapidly. And this new industrial power immediately generated national demands that just transcended all the old regional boundaries.
So the industrial changes spurred a powerful push for commercial unification.
Absolutely. There was intense pressure for commercial independence from foreign competitors, and crucially, a demand for national uniformity in domestic traffic and commerce.
This was the practical manifestation of nationalism then, the need for a German state that could facilitate a modern continental market.
And the sources detailed the bureaucratic steps they were demanding to achieve it.
What were they asking for?
The discussions were very concrete. They were focused on practical unification measures, like establishing a common German law on bills of exchange to standardize commercial instruments and creating a unified postal administration.
Things we take for granted today.
Completely. But back then, they were necessary to dissolve hundreds of regional barriers and truly enable a national money economy.
However, this rush toward modernization was inherently unstable, wasn't it? Made worse by recurring financial panic.
That instability is explicitly noted. Hildebrand highlights the recent credit crisis, a recurring feature of the developing German and international economies. This instability made it clear that the money economy, as it existed, was insufficient and required deep structural support.
Which led to the development of a credit system.
Exactly. It spurred the necessity of developing the credit system further, leading to the establishment of banking and credit institutions that could stabilize and allocate capital more rationally.
But all this commercial volatility was secondary to the moral collapse that society was witnessing. The shadow of pauperism hung over everything.
This is the existential core of the book. Hildebrand immediately pivots from commercial discussion to the suffering of the working classes. He mentions the unrest, specifically referencing the well-known weavers' disturbances in Silesia and Bohemia, showing that the crisis was widespread and explosive.
So it wasn't just cyclical unemployment, it was structural immiseration.
It was. And the social crisis forced a moral reckoning on the entire political system. Hildebrand crystallizes the central question facing the nation, framing it as a direct challenge to the ruling classes.
What was the question?
He asks, what social reforms does the widening gulf between the increasing poverty and the wealth require, and what obligations does the right of possession impose?
That framing is vital. It elevates economics from a science of wealth accumulation to a science of social justice and moral obligation.
Right. It implies that property is not absolute, but carries responsibilities to the community. His work, therefore, is intended not just to critique existing theories, but to establish a judgment on the economic culture of the present and, fundamentally, to provide a structured, scientific answer to the problem of pauperism.
And the reason he felt he had to write a new book wasn't just because the answers were hard, but because the existing methods were fundamentally incapable of finding them.
Precisely. He saw the intellectual chaos of the time, the conflicting doctrines of liberals, romantics, and socialists, as the inevitable result of applying faulty methodological tools. He demanded a rightful method, one suited to the scientific stuff of national economy.
Which for him meant moving past sterile abstraction and toward historical and statistical reality.
That's the whole game.
Okay, so let's begin the deep dive into his critique, starting with the behemoths he sought to take down. The classical school of Adam Smith, Ricardo, and Mill.
Hildebrand charged the classical school with a fundamental methodological sin, its relentless abstraction. He dismisses its viewpoint as one of abstract cosmopolitanism.
Meaning, they sought economic laws that were universal, timeless, and applicable everywhere, regardless of a nation's unique cultural context.
Right. They were trying to treat economics like physics, weren't they? Believing their laws were as timeless and unchangeable as gravity.
That's a perfect analogy.
They believed they could deduce particulars, like the price of grain or the rate of profit, from general abstract principles. They treated economic man as this calculating, atomized individual driven solely by self-interest.
And the key philosophical error, according to Hildebrand, lay in overlooking a profound truth.
The truth that man is always a child of civilization and a product of history.
So human needs, desires, behaviors, they aren't static. They're constantly shaped by culture, education, and the specific historical moment they inhabit.
Exactly. If human culture progresses, then economic laws must also be relative and progressive, not absolute and eternal. An economic theory that divorces itself from history, claiming universality, is thus doomed to fail.
It fails the scientific test because its foundations ignore observed reality.
It does. And so, in Hildebrand's view, the classical liberal system wasn't actually a universal truth at all. It was merely a snapshot, a detailed, functional description of one specific historical stage.
The money economy.
Correct. He asserted that the entire classical system, with all the sophisticated mechanics of Ricardo, was merely an expression of the currently dominant economic phase, the money economy, the Geldwirtschaft.
So it explained how it worked, but not why it created problems.
Exactly. It explained how the money economy worked, how it created wealth, and how individuals interacted within it. But because it lacked historical context, it couldn't offer solutions to the systemic social crises like pauperism that the money economy itself generated, nor could it envision the next necessary stage of cultural development.
Now, in stark contrast to Smith's cold abstraction, we move to the Romantic school of Adam Miller, which offered an almost spiritual view of the economy.
Mueller's school was a powerful ideological counterpoint. It championed national culture and ethical wholeness, explicitly rejecting the atomistic, utilitarian ideals of the Enlightenment.
For Miller, the state was everything.
Not just a legal contract, but the totality of human affairs. An organic, historical entity with its own self-contained purpose.
This connects directly back to ancient philosophy, doesn't it? Particularly Aristotle.
Precisely. Mueller drew heavily on the concept of man as a zoon politikon, the political or social animal. Man achieves fulfillment only within the framework of the state.
He sounds incredibly idealistic, even to the point of romanticizing the past.
He absolutely did. He romanticized the Middle Ages and its estate structure. And the way he integrated economics into this philosophy is, well, it's almost bizarrely specific.
How so?
Miller's economic theory used a four-elements constitution of the state, which he saw as analogous to a family structure.
Let's detail that, because it's a great example of the highly theoretical nature of the Romantic school. What were these four elements?
Okay, so the four elements were defined by function. Youth, representing development and progress. Age, representing conservation and tradition. Masculine, representing active production. And feminine, representing conservation of resources and spiritual life.
Wow. And how did this map onto society?
He saw these represented by the historical classes, the clergy, the nobility, the bourgeoisie, and the peasantry, each pursuing their own aims, but collectively required to produce harmony. The economy was just a reflection of this spiritual and organic whole.
That is a truly fascinating and surprising detail, seeing the economy structured by familial and historical archetypes. But Hildebrand, the man of 1848 facing mass poverty, he couldn't live in a philosophical ideal.
No. And while he fully appreciated Muller's profound critique of classical abstraction, which did successfully connect economics back to ethical principles, he ultimately rejected Miller's system as an unworkable, idealized return to a past that was fundamentally gone.
Because modern industrial life, the money economy, had already changed the ground rules too much.
Exactly. Modern states, like Prussia, had irreversibly moved past the feudal structure Mueller idealized. They'd recognized the division of land ownership, established freedom of trade, and most significantly acknowledged the enormous power of the money economy. Trying to suppress that and go back to medieval conditions would require a violent, highly improbable revolution.
So Bruno Hildebrand needed a forward-looking, historically informed method, which neither Smith's abstraction nor Miller's romantic backward glance could provide.
That's the dilemma.
This brings us to the third major school, and one much closer to Hildebrand's own methodological stance: Friedrich List's national system of political economy.
Right. Both List and Hildebrand focused on the nation as the key economic unit and believed in historical development. They were certainly allies in attacking Smith's free trade doctrine.
How did List structure his attack on the classical school?
He based it on three core failings. It's cosmopolitanism, which means ignoring the specific interests of the nation. It's materialism, focusing only on exchange value or wealth over productive capacity. And it's particularism, which is the assumption that individual self-interest automatically maximizes the national interest.
And List, unlike Smith, was explicitly pragmatic. He was focused on building up the economic power of nations that were lagging behind Britain.
His ultimate goal was profoundly practical. He wanted to justify and implement protective tariffs to nurture domestic manufacturing. He was following the example of Alexander Hamilton in America and aiming to lift German production to international parity.
And central to this guidance was List's own famous developmental model, a strict sequence of economic stages for national development.
Yes, List articulated a four-stage model that he believed nations had to pass through sequentially to reach full maturity.
Okay, what are the four stages?
First, the period of pastoral life, herdsmen. Second, the period of agriculture. Third, the period of agri-manufacturing, combining farming and industry.
And the final stage?
The period of agric-man of trade, which is full integration into the global economy.
This model seems highly rational. You build your resource base, you industrialize, and then you use that strength to dominate trade. But Hildebrand, the historian, found it deeply flawed.
The flaw, according to Hildebrand, was scientific and historical. He argued that List's four-stage theory was too prescriptive. It turned historical observation into a rigid, universal law, thereby repeating the very abstraction he had criticized in Smith.
And it contradicted key historical facts about the rise of great powers.
It did. He uses history to dismantle List. focusing specifically on England. List's model suggests manufacturing must be robust before global trade dominance can be achieved. But Hildebrand argues that England's rise to power did not adhere to this sequential path.
How so?
The development of English commercial power, its maritime dominance, occurred largely through colonial holdings and intermediate trade well before its industrial fabrication reached its zenith.
So trade, driven by geopolitics and colonialism, was often the driver of manufacturing growth, not the final stage that followed it.
Precisely. And Hildebrand backs this up with rigorous data, showcasing his statistical methodology. He notes that the tonnage of the English merchant fleet increased by a factor of 6.5 between 1663 and 1840.
Which is much more than List's theory would imply.
Way more. He uses these specifics to show that List overlooked the crucial historical importance of pure trade and exchange, like with the Hanseatic cities in Holland during the Middle Ages, whose influence predated large-scale national manufacturing.
Moving beyond the historical sequence, List famously critiqued Smith's ideal of the cosmopolitan division of labor, arguing nations should pursue a national division of labor, satisfying their own needs first.
Right. List argued that relying totally on free international trade leaves a nation vulnerable. It prevents it from cultivating the technical skills and human capital, the productive forces, that are necessary for true national maturity.
And Hildebrand's response to this is nuanced, isn't it? He doesn't completely reject the national perspective.
No, not at all. He agrees with the spirit of the critique. An exclusive cosmopolitan division of labor is partially unnatural and can hinder the higher moral cultural goals of mankind. So the national perspective is essential.
But he offers a deep warning regarding List's policy solution: protectionism.
This is a crucial point of divergence. Hildebrand warns that protectionism, if adopted prematurely or without rigorous statistical justification, compels an immature economy to adopt technical skills before it has the deep roots, the capital, the education, the resources, to sustain them naturally.
And the result is an unhealthy, forced growth.
Which creates a new social problem. This artificial growth leads to social ills and localized pauperism that the government then has to cure.
So for Hildebrand, policy must be empirically justified, not theoretically prescribed.
Always. The wisdom of a protective tariff should only be based on a rigorous statistical investigation of the domestic economy's unique capacities and needs.
Bruno Hildebrand has now systematically dismantled the three major establishment schools: classical, romantic, and national. So now he turns to the most radical intellectual challenge: the various socialist and communist doctrines, which he groups under the banner of these social economic theories.
And he treats these radical ideas not as sudden modern phenomena, but as historical reactions, deeply rooted in antiquity, against the perceived injustices of existing economic systems. He performs this fascinating genealogy of communistic thought to show its persistence.
Okay, let's trace those historical roots. What were the different types he identified?
He categorized them into three historical types. First, political communism from antiquity. He references, for example, Plato's Republic, where the state maintained exclusive sovereignty over land.
So that's focused on political structure. What's the second type?
The second is religious ascetic communism, embodied by early Christian sects. This form rejected private property, specifically to focus on spiritual life and detachment from earthly wealth.
And the third type, the one that directly relates to the 19th century crisis.
That is economic communism, which exploded in moments of social crisis like the Peasant Wars and the Reformation, with figures like Thomas Müntzer. These movements explicitly called for a necessary community of earthly possessions to address crushing inequality and material suffering. The 19th century versions just refined this economic focus into elaborate organizational schemes.
Okay, let's examine those schemes. Hildebrand dedicates significant space to reviewing the great French utopian thinkers, starting with the Saint Simonists.
The Saint Simonists introduced a radical, yet profoundly meritocratic social plan. Their core ideas centered on replacing hereditary right property passing based on blood relation with the right of merit.
So property would be allocated based on an individual's ability and contribution to society.
Exactly. And they also introduced a crucial social safety net component.
A minimum income.
Yes, they were early advocates for a minimum income for everyone, guaranteeing basic subsistence regardless of immediate productivity. They didn't abolish private property, but they wanted to manage wealth socially.
And how is that social management structured?
They proposed that, upon death, the estate of the deceased would not go to the family, but would be funneled through a centralized bank or management entity. This bank would then distribute that capital to the most capable individuals in society.
The goal being to maximize collective utility rather than satisfying familial claims.
Precisely, to ensure capital flowed to those with the greatest talent.
Then we have Fourier, whose system was almost obsessively structural and mathematical, the famous phalansteres.
Fourier's vision was total community design. He proposed organizing society into these communal settlements called phalansteres, ideal communities of about 1,500 to 2,000 people. The goal was engineered happiness and maximized production by aligning work with human passion.
But the key question for any economic system is compensation. How did Fourier propose distributing the wealth created in these communities?
The income distribution was meticulously proportional. It was based on a division among the three factors of production: capital, labor, and talent.
What was the breakdown?
The overall production was divided so that 412 went to capital, 512 went to labor, and 312 went to talent or intellectual knowledge. This formula tried to recognize the contributions of all three inputs.
And to ensure high productivity, he had a unique system for organizing work itself.
Yes, the series concept. Work was organized into series and groups to provide variety. The key psychological insight was that work must be varied and aligned with natural inclinations to avoid monotony. He sought to harness the power of competition, industrial rivalries, among different groups to maximize enthusiasm and production.
An incredible level of detail and planning. It really shows how seriously these utopians took the problem of social organization.
It does. They were trying to design a perfect social machine.
I think we need to pause for just a moment to let all these complex systems settle with our listener.
Good call.
Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy this podcast. Now, despite all that meticulous planning, from the St. Simonist central banks to Fourier's geometrically perfect communities Hildebrand, the man demanding a scientific historical solution rejects them all.
He dismisses all these socialist organization plans as fundamentally unfeasible. Furthermore, he states that if they were implemented, they would be destructive to human culture.
And his rejection is based on deep psychological skepticism. They relied on a flawed view of human nature.
Exactly. They ignore or attempt to eradicate what he sees as inherent human egoism. Hildebrand argues that without the drive of individual interest, ambition, and the natural spur of competition, which they sought to suppress, society would just descend into listless uniformity.
So the utopian effort to eliminate the problems of the money economy by eliminating ambition would ultimately destroy the very cultural development they hoped to promote.
For Hildebrand, competition and individual ambition were necessary, even if they required ethical management. It was a necessary cultural engine. The question for him was not how to abolish property or competition, but how to refine them, ethically and legally, to serve the collective welfare. And this brings us directly to his most detailed empirical fight.
This section is where Bruno Hildebrand moves definitively from theoretical critique to rigorous statistical and historical evidence. This is where he makes the strongest case for his new methodology.
And he does it by entering a direct confrontation with Friedrich Engels.
By 1848, Engels' work on the condition of the working class in England had become the definitive, devastating indictment of industrial capitalism. Hildebrand acknowledges Engels as the most gifted and knowledgeable among all German social writers who had launched this powerful moral attack on political economy.
Yes, and Engels' core argument was that the factory system itself, the machines, the concentration of labor, the oppressive urban environment, was the destroyer of culture. It demoralized workers, broke down families, and created a degraded, vicious proletariat.
Hildebrand agrees the proletariat is degraded, but he ruthlessly attacks the premise that the factory is the cause.
Right, so he uses comparative data. He refutes Engels' conclusion by contrasting the plight of the British industrial proletariat with the German handwork proletariat in regions that were still industrially undeveloped. He looked at his own backyard, Kurhessa.
He's essentially asking, if the factory is the sole source of this evil, why are we seeing absolute paralyzing poverty in places where the factory system and machine labor are almost entirely absent?
And he found rampant poverty and a desperate proletariat in the Marburg district of Kurhessen. And it existed not because of massive spinning mills or steam engines, but because of intense, unrestricted competition among small hand workers operating within an old patriarchal structure. They were pre-industrial, yet utterly destitute.
Can you give us a sense of the scale of this non-industrial poverty he documented?
The specifics are striking. In the Marburg district, with about 38,000 inhabitants in 1843, the Pauperism Relief Fund was over 11,000 thaler annually, a huge sum reflecting chronic, widespread need. He painted this visceral picture of hand workers' families subsisting mainly on potatoes, coffee, and minimal bread, rarely seeing meat.
The poverty was reaching catastrophic levels.
Catastrophic and morally devastating. Hildebrand noted that in the winter of 1846-1847, the poverty reached heights comparable to the sad epic of Irish poverty. He recounted tragic local cases, including a mother giving birth on the street outside Marburg and her newborn freezing to death, all in a district devoid of the industrial factories Engels blamed.
This evidence entirely reframes the social question. It argues that the characteristics Engels attributed solely to the factory worker, physical weakness, moral degradation, lack of self-respect, are actually the common traits of the proletariat across all sectors.
And that they're driven by unregulated competition and poverty, not by the machine itself. It moves the blame from the technology to the economic relationships. And Bruno Hildebrand reinforces this reversal with a rigorous comparison of material conditions, wages and prices.
Let's get into the hard numbers that Hildebrand used to make his point.
He showed that the material condition of the English worker was, statistically, improving. The price of a quarter of wheat in England had decreased substantially between 1816 and 1843.
But more importantly, he calculated purchasing power.
More crucially, yes. The English daily wage of a common laborer, measured against the price of a quarter of wheat, had nearly doubled since the middle of the 16th century.
So the English worker, despite the factory conditions, could afford significantly more grain than their ancestors.
Yeah.
What was the state of the German worker by comparison?
The contrast is devastating. While the English worker in 1843 required about 19 working days to earn a quarter of wheat, a German worker in a place like Hesse required 22 and 14 working days just to earn the price of a quarter of Kessel grain.
The non-industrial German laborer was materially worse off than the despised industrial proletariat of England.
Much worse off. And this quantitative evidence is a powerful rebuttal. But Hildebrand goes even further, directly challenging Engels' statistical accuracy regarding factory conditions.
This is the moment the statistician steps in to correct the polemicist.
Exactly. Hildebrand scrutinizes several of Engels' key claims. Regarding the composition of the factory workforce, Engels claimed that 56% and 14% of cotton workers were female. Hildebrand's official sources showed only 47%.
A significant overstatement, but in wool manufacturing, the discrepancy was much wider.
Immense. Engels claimed 69.5% of wool manufacturing workers were female. Official tables showed the actual reality was only 29.8%. This nearly 40 percentage point discrepancy undermines the argument that factory work was overwhelmingly reliant on and destructive to female labor.
And he also challenges the narrative that the Industrial Revolution was actively degrading British morality, specifically by looking at crime rates.
Right. Hildebrand directly counters the notion that the English nation was becoming more criminal. He demonstrated that the crime rate, relative to the growing population, did not worsen between 1832 and 1846. In fact, he showed the total number of committed crimes actually declined slightly in the later years of that period, suggesting a possible improvement in British morality.
And he uses geography to drive home the point that factory work might actually be a stabilizing, civilizing force.
He compares industrial and agricultural regions. He demonstrates that industrial districts like Lancashire, the supposed moral cesspool, according to Engels, showed lower crime rates per capita than purely agricultural regions like Ireland.
And his conclusion from that?
His conclusion is provocative. Factory work, rather than destroying morality, provided regular activity and structure, which helped previously disorganized, poverty-stricken immigrants like the Irish who flooded into England to stabilize their lives.
That is a total paradigm shift. Bruno Hildebrand argues that organized labor, even in a factory, can introduce a kind of social order and morality that was absent in unregulated pre-industrial poverty.
This statistical deep dive solidifies his methodological demand. The new economic science must rely on these meticulous statistical and historical comparisons to provide solutions, not just emotional critiques. It makes the book a powerful intellectual weapon precisely because it is grounded in data, not just philosophy.
Having successfully demolished the empirical claims of the socialists, Hildebrand must now solidify his own ground by defending the fundamental economic institutions that had come under attack.
Right, particularly private property, trade, and money.
And he argues forcefully that property is not the inherent source of societal demoralization, as the communists claimed.
On the contrary, he sees it as the necessary prerequisite for human culture and advancement.
What, in his view, was the state of society before property?
A state of savagery and lack of culture. It was the establishment of private property that first allowed for individual effort, for surpluses of labor, and for the gradual development of higher, non-survivalist cultural pursuits.
So he views property as the bedrock of the family, the ethical basis of all community, and the wellspring of individual moral strength.
And without it, society would remain a dull, uniform multitude without culture and without development. For Hildebrand, abolishing property is a rejection of civilization itself.
So the problem isn't the institution.
The problem is the abuse of the institution, the selfish, irresponsible pursuit of wealth without regard for the common good.
This leads him to propose an ethical corrective to the money economy. How should property be viewed in the future?
It must be increasingly viewed as a moral and spiritual trust granted by the community. This perspective redefines ownership not as an absolute individual right, but as a temporary conditional responsibility granted by the collective state for the purpose of promoting cultural and social welfare.
This is a critical philosophical move, distinguishing him from pure classical liberalism.
It is, and he applies a similar measured defense to trade and money, institutions often demonized by utopian critiques.
How does he defend them?
He defends trade as a necessary social form and a fundamental lever of culture. Trade connects communities, disseminates knowledge, and specializes skills. Abolishing it would reverse cultural progress.
And money.
As for money, he argues the critique confuses the means of crime with its cause.
If money is the means, what is the cause?
The underlying source of corruption is the selfish nature of human action: greed, ambition, egoism. Abolishing money would only remove the opportunity for certain crimes, but it would not eradicate the base human impulses that lead to moral corruption.
Finally, he engages briefly with Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the figure who famously declared property is theft.
He does. Hildebrand respects Proudhon's intellectual vigor but finds his ultimate solutions lacking coherence. He specifically dismisses Proudhon's laborious attempts to find an absolute and unchangeable measure of value, based purely on crystallized labor.
And why does Hildebrand deem that pursuit futile?
For him, value is inherently complex and relative. He defines value as involving both subjective utility value, how useful something is to an individual, and objective exchange value, the market price. Trying to distill this complexity down to a simple labor measure just ignores the subjective human element and social dynamics.
But he does find common ground with Proudhon on the necessity of one key economic force: competition.
Absolutely. Hildebrand saw competition as an indispensable force for the full development of human productive powers. It spurs innovation, keeps prices rational, and holds the individual accountable.
So when competition is absent, industry stagnates.
It becomes a monopoly. Therefore, competition is necessary for cultural dynamism, even if the state must intervene to mitigate its abusive social effects, like the extreme poverty seen in Kherson.
This sets the stage for his prescription. The money economy is here to stay, competition is necessary, property is essential. The path forward must integrate these realities while solving the social crisis.
And looking back at the comprehensive critique in Die National Economy, Bruno Hildebrand's 1848 work acts as an intellectual staging ground. He systematically shows that no existing school possessed the scientific method necessary to guide the modern nation through the crisis of pauperism.
So to quickly summarize the landscape, the classical school of Smith and Ricardo was too abstract. It merely described the mechanics of the money economy without providing an ethical or historical roadmap.
The Romantic school of Muller was ethically rich but completely impractical, clinging to feudal fantasies. And Liszt provided the necessary national focus, but based his policy solutions on historically flawed, rigid developmental stages.
The path forward, therefore, required a total overhaul. This is where Hildebrand proposes the necessary future stage: the credit economy.
This stage is Hildebrand's answer to the social crisis created by the money economy. It's the fulfillment of his ethical corrective property as a social trust.
How exactly does the credit economy move beyond the money economy and address the problems of competition and pauperism?
The credit economy is based on organizing and centralizing the fragmented individual capital of the money economy. Instead of selfish, individualistic competition dominating, credit institutions like specialized banks, insurance companies, cooperatives act as collective managers of risk and capital allocation.
So the central mechanism is utilizing collective trust.
And coordinated capital to fund larger-scale, more stable projects, ensuring capital flows to areas of national social benefit rather than purely private speculative gain.
So it's a system designed to regulate and rationalize the volatile chaos of the money economy, transforming individual wealth into collective managed investment that serves social welfare, thereby curbing the abuses that lead to pauperism.
Exactly. It synthesizes the organizational needs of modern industrial production with the ethical demands of the community. It is the realization of his historical law that economic relationships change as culture changes.
And this brings us to the legacy you, the listener, should retain. Bruno Hildebrand's central message for modern economic science can be distilled into three fundamental takeaways.
First, economics must be historical. Economic laws are relative, not universal. They develop and change alongside the cultural maturity and specific historical circumstances of the people being studied. Economics is a dynamic historical science, not a static mechanical one.
Second, the stages are key. Economic development proceeds through distinct, observable, and sequential economic stages: the natural exchange economy, the money economy, and crucially, the ethical and managed credit economy. Policy must be based on correctly identifying a nation's current stage.
And third, the social question is central. The aim of economic science is fundamentally ethical. It must focus its methodology, especially through statistical rigor, on addressing social needs, most urgently the crisis of pauperism. Abstract wealth calculation is insufficient. The goal is the moral and cultural development of the community.
As a final provocative thought, let's reflect on Hildebrand's methodology. He dedicated his work to two friends: Robert Bunsen, the chemist and pioneer in experimental science, and Heinrich von Seibel, the eminent historian.
And that connection, empirical, factual science combined with deep historical analysis is his antidote to empty theory. He demanded that economic science synthesize historical trajectory and rigorous statistical fact-finding to avoid illusion and address real suffering.
So, if Bruno Hildebrand successfully defined the credit economy as the necessary next stage beyond the money economy in 1848, then the question for us today, facing the complexity of global digital finance, cryptocurrencies, massive data flows, and intangible knowledge capital, is this:
Are we currently operating under a new, yet-to-be-defined economic stage, far beyond the credit economy that he theorized?
is the information economy or the digital credit economy our new historical stage, requiring entirely new ethical and statistical frameworks to manage its unique crises? It is a question that demands the same historical and empirical rigor he insisted upon nearly 2 centuries ago.